It always amuses me when the first question I am asked about forming a captive is, where should the domicile be? And perhaps the one who asks that question is wondering whether it'll be a domicile that they might be able to do scuba diving in, or perhaps it's a domicile where they could go skiing. And I always reply, yes, the domicile choice is indeed based on the trip. But then I must explain. TRIP is an acronym for taxes, regulations, infrastructure, and perception. 4 very important factors that definitely influence the domicile choice. The first one is quite clear, taxes. Whether the entity forming or using the captive is a for-profit entity or a tax-exempt entity, they want to make sure they go to a domicile that provides the best possible tax outcome and does not create an unnecessary tax burden. Therefore, it is very necessary for those considering the use of a captive to work with tax advisors to find out whether, first of all, it would be better to form their captive offshore, or whether it would be better to have an onshore domicile. And that, by the way, is true not just for US insureds, but also for insureds that are owned by entities headquartered in other locations. Once the onshore-offshore question has been determined, if a decision is made to go onshore, tax advice may be necessary to ensure that the right state is selected in terms of making sure that the state income taxes of the corporate parent are not negatively impacted by the domicile choice. So after the tax issue has been dealt with, it will then be necessary to go on and look at the regulations that will be relevant to the captive, both in its formation process and then ongoing as it is regulated. There are 2 key things that we recommend that the prospective captive owner will look at. One is capitalization. Of course, we're not recommending that you simply go to the domicile that has the lowest capital requirement. We are recommending that based on the amount and type of business to be written in the captive, a domicile is selected that has an appropriate way of calculating capitalization requirements. A very small captive may indeed find that it's more capital efficient to go to a domicile that has a lower minimum capital requirement. But again, a larger captive may find it more appropriate to be in a different domicile. The filings include captive statements, captive audits, actuarial reports. It's necessary to work with a captive manager to determine which of these states or countries where captives are domiciled have regulations for filings that are appropriate to the type of captive that will be used. Infrastructure is a very interesting question. Domiciles that have been around for a number of years usually have a very solid infrastructure. A lot of captive managers, they may indeed have banks that do a lot of work or investment managers that work with captives. It is necessary sometimes to look at the cost of the services provided in the domicile to make sure that the infrastructure is not only solid in experience but is reasonably priced. And it's interesting too to remember that in the captive world, regulators are also a part of infrastructure. There is, within the captive world, a good relationship between the captives and the regulators. Nobody wants to go to a domicile where you can't pick up the phone and call a regulator in order to discuss a specific issue about the formation or operation of your captive. So infrastructure is definitely an important element. Now we come to the end of our trip analysis by looking at the perception issues that definitely influence domicile choice. First of all, within many organizations, there may be a corporate culture that will come into play and influence whether or not that business is willing and able to form a subsidiary in an offshore domicile. It could well be that for certain types of companies, it's going to work better for them to do business in an onshore domicile. So that is a perception matter that has to be dealt with internally. Second of all, there are also influences of the captive service providers. They may be the brokers, perhaps they are the captive managers or consultants, perhaps they are the attorneys. They too will have their own perceptions about where is a good place to do business, where is an efficient place to do business. It may be guided on by where they have their offices. And so the perception factors do come into play. And indeed, when we look at the trip analysis, we might find no difference between the taxes, the regulations, and the infrastructure to influence choice, and perhaps the decision ultimately will be driven by perception factors. There are, of course, many, many good domiciles, both onshore and offshore, and so make sure you do your trip analysis carefully.